Hey there, so I got another deck guide today. This time we're going to be going over a Blue Han build, a thing I've been working on for a little bit. I also want to give a brief shout out to a couple people. There's Drownack in Discord. I know he's been playing a Blue Han for a while. He calls it his Force Friends Blue Han. So he's been messing with this build for a while. And then also my boy Matty Gem, who I've been spitballing ideas with, and he actually took a very similar list to the one that I'm going to present here to a 1K in Connecticut, and did pretty well with it. So he's also been helpful. All right, so here we go. We got Blue Han, different take on a Han build, not your typical composition compared to some of the other Hans. Here's the list. What I'm going to do is break down all the cards in here, give some matchup input. We'll have some conversation about resourcing with Han, a few conversation about some of the specific cards in the deck, and like the sideboard stuff. Also, later in the video, I'll be presenting a different version of this deck for a control meta. So specifically if you're encountering a lot of like the Vader blues and stuff, like the mill decks, we'll have kind of a different version of this deck, fairly similar, that is meant to really beat up on that. All right, so first off, why are we doing Blue Han, not Green Han, not Red Han, not Mono Yellow Han? Okay, so Green Han is sort of the de facto good Han. I think it's probably the one that's been doing the best in most gameplay. It's got a really powerful 7-drop, which is kind of Han's shtick, right? It's got U-Wing reinforcement, and he follows that up with a potential home 1. It's a really huge back-to-back play that he can present in that green deck for tons of card advantage. So we need to figure out, why are we doing blue? What is it better at? So first of all, we get a banger of a 7-drop 2, which is Luke. And it does something a little different than U-Wing. Instead of going wide, right, it's going tall. But it is basically the most powerful straight-up like ground unit we can play at that cost. It interacts pretty well with a lot of different meta decks right now, right? It has the option of defeating Svet's fire sprays if you can line that up. The Restore can stabilize you in a lot of matchups, again, against like Sabine, against Boba. So Luke, huge draw. Second, Obi-Wan. So the issue Han has sometimes is that his play for going from 5 resources to 7 resources is extremely telegraphed. Everyone kind of knows it's coming, right? You're at 5 resources, you use Han's ability, you go to 6, you deploy him, you attack with him, you get to 7. Okay. That doesn't work all the time. And a lot of decks don't, like a lot of Han versions don't have a very proactive 6-drop to play. So like the green decks for now have been playing Rogue Skirmisher. It's a solid card, the 4/6 ambush ship, vehicle actually. And like the red version has black one, but it's not really the proactive play you want it to be, because it's kind of like the thing you want to do after you gotta get everything done. Blue gets Obi-Wan, and I think he is very important to this deck. Not only does he protect your life, he protects Han himself, right? So against things like Boba Fett specifically, who's notoriously very difficult for Han to deal with, it's really hard to just deploy Han into their board. Most people playing Han need to game it so that they're really not trying to go do the 5 to 7 route, because Boba can like kill him with Surprise Strike, Barrage. There's no Good to Me Dead, which locks him up completely. It's tough for them. So we kind of have to delay a turn usually to really go into our top end, right? Like the 7 drops, 8 drops. Obi-Wan is a very proactive play that not only protects Han, but they have to get him off the table before they can get to Han. And if Han can get buffed by the experience that Obi-Wan provides, you have a much better shot of him surviving into future turns, continuing your ability to temporarily ramp. So Obi-Wan was kind of like the main thing I was looking at. Like I was really, when playing Han, I was always really annoyed that if like my 5 to 7 didn't work, I felt like I was stumbling a lot. Now I know the green decks in a way have tried to solve this either with that 6 drop or just playing a slower game plan to just not really try for that play against a lot of decks. But blue has a different angle, and Obi-Wan is a very important part of that. So between him and Luke, we have some strong plays, and then we also have like another really powerful 3 drop, in my opinion, to play on turn 1, which is Yoda. And then also we've got the base, which talk about right now. This is kind of barely played, this base in general. I think it's mostly been considered not very good, but I think it offers something very important in this deck. So we have a lot of really powerful turn 1 plays because we can play a 3 drop on turn 1. And often the correct thing to do when you're playing this deck is to immediately shield up one of your 3 drops. We've got Ezra, crazy with the shield, right? Like he's going to recreate card advantage himself. He's probably going to be able to take out some units. You got Yoda, the same thing. A little weaker because it's not often going to be able to trade into a lot of units, but against certain decks where that Restore 2 is relevant, it's going to be there for a long time. Same thing with Falcon, although Falcon often doesn't even need a shield. It's not that you need to throw the shield out on the first unit you ever play. There's great 4 drops, right? We got Kanan, another really good unit with a shield. We play Sentinels throughout the curve, Gamoran Guards, Chewbacca, Obi-Wan, right? All good with shield. In fact, the only matchup that maybe you could say that 5 health would be more important would be maybe Sabine, but I think in general, this deck's kind of already doing pretty well into her. So we're good taking the security complex. And even there, right, shielding a Sentinel, it's brutal for them. They need to spend quite a lot of resources or have their like spec force, and we can get a lot of advantage with this base. And I think it's a really important part of this build. Obviously, against some decks, you need to figure out a way to use it that isn't just so proactively. Like if you're playing against Waylay decks, I don't think I'm using it turn 1. But it's something you can try to squeeze into a turn to use it and then immediately attack into something to get the value quickly from the shield, so you don't give them the opportunity to do something like a Waylay or a takedown or a vanquish, right? There are a lot of spaces where you can fit this in and get that value out of it. On top of that, I mean, sometimes you just do it and like ask the question, right? Do you have the answer? I think a lot of playing Han is that, because a lot of what we do is telegraphed, right? When you use his ability, you're giving them, you're like basically telling them, here, I'm going to play something big. They can even usually just pass to wait to see what you're going to do. So I think you have to embrace the Han, right? Like embrace the fact that sometimes they'll have an answer and you'll get 2 for 1 because you spent a resource, or in this case, you used your base and they immediately killed your unit. You try to do your best to like get around that, but yeah, sometimes just be okay with them having the answer. All right, core units. We've got the 3/3 drops, Yoda, Ezra, Falcon. These are all very powerful turn 1 plays. Kind of the bread and butter is to play one of these turn 1. We do have some cards that don't require ramp to play on turn 1, which we'll go over, but that's kind of like your core trio. We've got our 4 drops, Kanan, another beast. So like if we don't ramp turn 1, often ramping into Kanan on turn 2 is very powerful. Same with the Liberator gunship. A turn 2 gunship will eat up basically any space unit if it hasn't been buffed. Gamoran Guards starts our Sentinel train. We have a lot of yellow units, not only the ones here, but all our low drops are also yellow. So it is often a Sentinel. It's something you can also play, and if it's in play before you deploying Han immediately will turn the Sentinel on these guys. They've been pretty good. Then we got Chewbacca continuing the Sentinel train. He's big enough to dodge takedown, so he's a pretty good shield target as well, just kind of proactively. Another good card to protect. 5 drop is also an important thing in this deck because of the 5 to 7 turn that Han can present. Being able to play a 5 drop with another 2 drop, strong play. And Syndicate Lackeys, ambush, right? So we don't have a ton of like event removal in this deck, so this kind of acts as a vanquish for us. The fact that it can one-shot Sabine on the turn she comes out because of our ramp, very powerful. The card's been pretty impressive in general. 5 power ambush is a strong stat line. All right, here are the little guys. Greedo and Lawful Insurgent are very acceptable turn 1 plays. Often if I have them, and like something like a Kanan, I think I would rather play one of them and then ramp into the Kanan as opposed to ramping immediately into a 3-drop. Although in-game circumstances might change that, right? If someone leads with a Green Squadron A-Wing, you are ramping into a Falcon if you have it and taking it out. Leia, on the other hand, is not really something we're happy about playing on turn 1 unless we can pair it with a Greedo. But she is a strong utility card. It's a 2-drop that works with our 2+5 plan if we can't safely deploy Han into an empty board. She just offers help in racing, installing. Usually you're not doing this for the extra resource unless you really are trying to pair it with something like a Greedo on the first turn. But she is a strong card, very helpful in a lot of situations. And that's why she's a 3 of. Oh, and all 3 of these cards are yellow, so they all turn on the Gamorrean guards. All right, here's the big guys, right? So we talked about Obi a lot. It's kind of like a huge reason why we decided to move into blue. A proactive 6-drop to play ahead of Han coming out is powerful. Naturally, we do still want a big army of 7s, right? Like there are matchups where we'll be able to just do the 5-7. Here they are. Luke, very powerful. Just what a beast. We'll play all 3. We'll play 2 Hans. Can consider going up to 3 if you want to cut something else. I think mostly I'm happy with having 5 of them, and I think Luke is just better than Han. Redemption is a 1 of. Another card that I think you could play a 2 of. Just was more of a room consideration. It's a helpful card, especially against something like Boba Fett, where like it can brick a fire spray pretty well. If you ever get to a matchup point against Sabine where you can play this, it basically immediately ends the game. So yeah, these are the big things. And the events. So Spark of Rebellion I'm incredibly high on this card right now. I think it's showing that it's kind of hitting the spot against a lot of these control decks, but I think even against things like Boba, it's very important. Talk about this a little more in detail later. Surprise Strike is a 3, so we are still in general an aggressive slanted deck, especially when playing against control decks. Surprise Strike is an important card there. It also is kind of the best leader sniper in the game. I was thinking about 2, 3, sometimes I even moved them into the sideboard, but I landed on this is just kind of too important of a card for the yellow pool right now to not play the full trio. Waylay's temporary removal. It's a really important card, especially against units that get buffed, like wing leadered units. It's a good catch-all in racing situations. It's a really good answer to something like a fire spray or bouncing a sentinel. I think it's just a very strong utility card. It's important to have. I put 1 forces with me in this deck. I think there's a lot of upside to this. We do have a bunch of force units. Unfortunately, though, the leader isn't force, so it's not as reliable as it is in something like a turret deck or something. But it's just a 1 of. I think in general, like I don't like cards that have really big downsides, and obviously like sometimes this card doesn't do anything, so or do much, right? It's sometimes too weak to be useful. But I think there is like merit to playing more of this, especially if you're going to be in a more aggressive deck. If you're like you're gonna really try to play a more aggro version of this deck, and maybe you also include something like Jedi Lightsaber, you might want to bump up copies of this too. Vigilance, I mean, this card's in almost every blue deck at this point, even at costing 6. It's proven to be really strong, especially against Sabine, against Boba, right? Like the kill a medium or small unit plus heal 5. That heal 5 often is like a full turn's worth of damage, plus you killed something. It's a good bridge card into your other 7s. It's another 6-drop in this deck. Now, it's not usually what we want to be playing on the Han turn, but there are situations where it makes sense, especially against aggro. One takedown. Kind of would want more. I have a second in the sideboard, but it didn't fit the main game plan. I think in the matchups you probably want this card more are against things like Churret and Iden, where you can try to snipe their leader. It's good against Sabine, but again, I think this deck is already slanted to beat Sabine pretty well, so it's not something I wanted too much of in the main deck. It's a solid card, it's just not always super impressive. All right, here's the sideboard. We've got Confiscates. With the rise of people using Entrench as a removal, especially a 2-cost removal for your leader, I think it's time to start including some more upgrade hate. Unfortunately, these colors don't have anything better than Confiscate, so that's what we got. Restock, it's a 1-of. In addition, we got the third Vigilance in the sideboard. So it's an important note here. This plan for playing Restock against the mill decks, like the Blue Vader, only really makes sense if you won game 1. If you won game 1, you can sideboard into a Restock in your third Vigilance and mostly just play to go to time in game 2. You have enough answers to their big units, like with the Vanquishes in here also, and the fact that we play a lot of just like ground units like Luke and Han that can like basically interact with their Charlton and their Darth Vader, that if you win game 1, it's going to be basically impossible for them to mill you 2 games in a row. And if you play your own Restock and your own third Vigilance, you can kind of just battle them on their terms, right? You're just going to play a mill game, but you've got Spark of Rebellions to rip out their Restocks and Vigilances, and you'll probably just be able to win. Unfortunately, if you lose game 1, it's going to be really hard to beat them 2 in a row with this plan, which is why we're going to talk about a deck configuration later that is geared for that. But another consideration I'll have, that since you have this option for the sideboard, if game 1 is not looking good for you pretty early, right? We're talking 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes. You can concede and just go right into that mill plan, okay? If you can try to win 2 in a row, it's hard. It's almost impossible, but at least you can win 1. A double loss is technically better for you than just losing, because then your opponent will also have a loss in the event. I think there is a little bit of an issue with time regarding these mill decks. I don't actually expect them to be like forever prominent because of this. I think, especially in matches where they're playing like control mirrors, where like that is the primary win con, it's tough for them to be able to win 2 games out of 3. But we do have this sideboard plan. It makes game 1 much more important, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so Devotion, good versus Sabine. We just added a little bit more to short that matchup. We got the third Vigilance, which I talked about for the mill stuff, but it's also just a good card again against Sabine, against Boba Fett, even against things like Churret, which you have a lot of units you can kill with it, and even getting some damage on Churret you can kill with Vigilance. We got the extra takedown, the 2 Vanquishes. So Vanquishes, again, probably against control decks playing capital ships, against Boba, who has Fire Spray. And threw in 1 Change of Heart, mostly for the control matchups, to see if like stealing like an Avenger or Devastator at the end can take you there. All right, a little bit of tips about resourcing with Han. So generally, you want to do it 2 times. On the first or second turn, and then on the Han flip turn, which will be when you have 5 resources. Now, this is not like always, right? This is just something you need to think about. You can't do the ability every turn. You will run out of cards. So that's kind of how I like to think about it in general, is 2 times before the flip. On the first or second turn, the idea of using his ability is just to get ahead on board. You are deploying something bigger than your opponent on the first turn. You can usually kill whatever they play. You gain your tempo advantage there, and then you can start following up with even tempo plays with them until your Han flip turn, which you try to do it again. So we talked about the 3 drops, Yoda, Falcon, Ezra, all powerful turn 1 plays. We've got Kanan as a really strong turn 2. Sometimes, though, you're going to need to use this ability more proactively against matchups where card advantage matters even less, which is usually against aggro. You might even do it the first 2 or 3 turns and just run out of cards, but just delete everything they have. Like getting a Chewbacca out on turn 3 or a Syndicate Lackeys on turn 3 can be really strong. So consider that. And then we've got Luke, Han, Obi. These are the cards you're trying to play specifically on your flip turn. Ideally, we play the 7, right? If we have that locked up, if we know resourcing with Han, flipping him, he's going to get his attack, then yeah, we want to get our 7s. But often Obi-Wan is a very good backup plan there. You just resource with Han, you put Obi out, you deploy Han, and based on how the game is going at that point, if you can claim initiative without attacking with Han, sometimes that's going to be correct, so that you can lead your next turn with a Han attack and immediately get to 7 resources before he gets defeated, right? Because if you just get your 4 damage in with your Han, you're getting 1 resource that turn, but you've already spent 6 if you played Obi-Wan, which means you're not playing anything. And then if your opponent has initiative and is able to immediately defeat your Han, you'll be stuck at 6 for another turn. So you want to, like, the Obi into Han play is often to set up your next turn, which will have a 7. The other thing, the reason I included Spark here is because that's a really good way to do a 7 resource turn with Han. Resourcing with him to go up to 6 and then playing Spark, and then having your opponent prepare to take him out, but then sparking them and ripping out whatever. I mean, if they only had one answer, right? Maybe it was a barrage. Maybe it was a no good to me dead. Maybe it was a steadfast battalion when they have a leader out, right? Whatever it is that you think might prevent you from deploying Han that turn, you grab it, clear the road for him so that he can come out, attack, and then you can follow up with a 5-drop. Something like Chewbacca would be a really strong follow-up to that because it will likely protect Han into the next turn so that you can play a 7-drop. All right, really briefly, don't be afraid to let this back into your hand. It generally will generate a lot of tempo for you when you play it, especially if you're brawling in space with it. So it's not too bad to like give that tempo back by bouncing this into your hand. You need, like, sometimes the Han turn, especially, you need all your resources. You don't want to exhaust a resource with this. So any turn that you haven't activated Han's ability where you would have to pay this tax, you need to really think about what your sequence might be and whether or not it's worth keeping this out, especially against decks that might remove it immediately and then you don't even get to attack with it. You just don't be afraid to bounce it. That's really all I want to say about that. All right, Spark of Rebellion. High on this card right now, I think, with the rise of control, especially these Vader blue decks, but also Palpatine being pretty strong and good against mid-range decks. And then even like the Krennic greens and Idens, like that's where the Spark really shines. But it's not bad against Boba either. Boba Fett can often run out of like main threats that it has. It's not a super threat heavy deck outside of like the Fire Sprays and Vaders, nothing in there. Well, and the Barrages, it's not super dense in terms of like power cards. Being able to grab some important things, use this proactively to protect your Han flip turn. It's just been pretty strong. It's not something you often want to play against Sabine. So if you're in a like heavy Sabine meta, you can consider putting this in your sideboard. But right now, I'm playing 3 of this. It's a huge draw for playing yellow hero in the first place, which I think in general has a pretty weak card pool. But I really want to put this card in decks right now, and that's why we're here. All right, a little bit of matchup talk. So Sabine. Han in general is able to kind of be favored against her because we just play bigger units ahead of her and just control the board in that way. Falcon dominates their space. Something like Ezra will dominate their ground on the first turn. Bringing Yoda out on the first turn, you're going to start healing a bunch. We've got the shield base, which maybe isn't at its best here, but it's going to allow us to create even more profitable trades. We've got Sentinels up and down the curve. We got the ambush ship. We've got a lot of answers. Oh, and Syndicate Lackey one-shotting her, right? Against her specifically is where I think you can very aggressively use Han's ability. even the first 3 turns and like become empty-handed. It's not too bad. Usually though, it's 2 times, right? On turn 1, I'd love to play a 3, and then on turn 2, if I have Kanan, I'd love to do that. But if not, I'll usually ramp to get into a 5 drop the next turn, either Chewbacca to completely brick their ground, or a Syndicate Lackeys to one-shot their Sabine. Both very strong. All right, Boba, a tough matchup. Boba in general has been very good against Han, specifically because a lot of the cards he has can kill him before Han even gets an attack off. So we talked about Barrage, Surprise Strike on most of their units, No Good to Me Dead. All that stuff's really annoying for Han to deal with. And Boba just coming out early and being bigger than Han is tough. Steadfast Battalion. Not many answers to Fire Spray, although we've got some, right? Main deck, we've got something like Luke that can interact with it. Waylay, obviously, just to delay it. Other than that, though, we don't have a ton, right? It will usually take multiple cards. Post board, we can add our Vanquishes, which is important for Fire Spray. In general, though, we want to try to get ahead early against Boba, and often we need to proactively use our shield and hope they don't have a Waylay, which is okay. They don't always have a Waylay. And then Obi-Wan is very important in this matchup because he's kind of the key here to not letting your Han get one shot. It gives us that proactive play to like set up for the next turn. All right, Vader, just briefly, because we're going to talk about this in a second. It's tough, but Spark of Rebellion is probably the best thing we got here. Entrench on your Han is really tough main deck, but we've got Confiscates for that post board. We need to be aggro, and we need to hope Spark clears the way for like a super laser blast so that we can get there with damage. It's not super easy, but we've got a sideboard plan for this matchup, especially if we win the first game. We can sideboard into like an anti-mill strategy. Chirrut, I mentioned this specifically. I don't think it's very popular, but force throw decks in general are very tough for Han because he tends to be a little lower in cards than most other decks, often having to chuck big units at his own things. Takedown is an important card against Chirrut, obviously. It's not usually to kill him immediately when he comes out because it's really hard to sequence that. They're usually able to like action churn enough that it's not really profitable. But where it is profitable is you get some damage on Chirrut the next turn and then finish it off with a takedown or a vigilance, right? That's kind of the idea there. And we're only playing one takedown in the main deck, so if you're expecting a lot of things like Chirrut or even like Iden, where takedown would be really powerful, then I'd encourage you to up that number. Just be aware that force throw decks are strong against you. There's not much you can do as a Han player to counteract that other than, again, Spark of Rebellion. It is kind of our catch-all. So if you see force throws, you might need to aggressively spark them out of their hands so that you can like keep using Han's ability without it becoming a liability. Palp here I include as kind of like the generic control deck. This would also include things like Krennic and Iden, although I think Palp is probably the most difficult for us because we are a little slower than other mid-range decks, right? We're playing like blue units, which tend to be a little understated on the front end compared to their back end. And Palp, you know, we don't have any healing on any of our units, so he's going to steal something good usually, which is really tough, right? If he steals like an Obi-Wan or a Luke, it's just like really hard to beat him. It's another one where I think the game one is like the important one, because if we can win game one and sideboard into that stall plan with vigilances and restocks, these decks don't tend to be super threat heavy, and we actually are a pretty good like anti-control deck on the ground. Like we're pretty good at not dying to them, which is not, it's just that we're not usually really good at killing them quickly enough. Especially if they play capital ships. Not all Palpatines do, but definitely be aware of that. So post board, we've got Vanquishes for those ships, and we've got our anti-mill plan. All right, so here's another deck list that I made that I think will just make you straight up favored into these mill decks, especially like the Vader blue deck. We have put one restock in the main deck. We've put 2 Vanquishes in the main deck. We put the 3rd Vigilance in the main deck. And basically, we just are a mill deck against them main deck. We have 3 Sparks of Rebellion in addition to the same mill package that they have. So if we can steal their restock or copies of their Vigilance, we'll just be ahead in the mill war. On top of that, we just have a lot of units that they have to interact with, or units that we can use to kill their very few relevant threats, right? These decks basically have like Vader, the bleeder, which, you know, he'll usually require 2 or 3 cards to answer, but it's not like he's going to do 25 damage to us very quickly. We have Luke and Han, right? We just need to like hurt him a little, and then our units can finish him off. They're not really buffing him. And then they have Avengers, which we have Vanquishes for. We also have Spark of Rebellion, right? We just can play their game, but probably just be a little better at it because we get to play a bunch of Sparks. I don't think it would be a particularly fun sequence to go through. If you see a lot of Vaders, I would probably just play an aggro deck until they stop queuing up with it. But I think if you want just that main deck option to deal with those decks, because that game 1 is so important, then this is kind of how I would configure it. It is important to remember that because game 1 is so important, if you like really want to win these matchups, it needs to be your main deck plan. It can't be your post board plan, because you are just not going to be able to win a mill game 2 times in a row after losing game 1. So this is why I included that package. We had to trim some cards, obviously, right? There's 1 less Kanan in here. I cut the surprise strikes because that's no longer our plan against control. We're not trying to be aggro there anymore. But yeah, we're basically, the rest of the deck is mostly the same. It should still function pretty well against Sabine. I don't think there's anything wrong about playing the Vanquish's main deck to shore up answers for Fire Spray. So if you wanted to like do something in between this and just like cut the 3rd Vigilance, cut the restock, but keep the 2 Vanquishes, at that point I'd probably just include the 3rd Kanan, and then maybe a surprise strike or a 2nd takedown, something like that. But yeah, I just wanted to give this as an option and talk about why I think this configuration would be favored into a Vader blue mill deck. But you'd have to like really want to play that kind of game. All right, just briefly, some cards I didn't include, but that you could include. So Shoot First is a strong card against Sabine. Again, I just think the deck's pretty strong already against her. Restored Arc, the issue with this card, it's kind of a core 2 drop in Hero Blue, but the issue in this deck is, first of all, we don't play Fleet Lieutenant and Wing Leader, so this 2/3 is never getting any bigger. So it's just really slow at dealing with anything in space. And because we have more options on turn 1 plays because of all the 3s we play, I prefer to just have my turn 1 plays either be the 3 drops or the 3 power 2 drops and 1 drops, like Greedo and the Insurgent. So that's why I've neglected it, but I think it is an option. Regional Governor, I think this would be, again, for like a heavy anti-control meta call where you're trying to like snipe Super Laser Blast on a key turn. It's kind of a similar thing with Bodhi. I think Bodhi for 5 is just, it's okay. Like, I think you can consider it, especially if we want to do something like Spark of Rebellion and Bodhi on the same like flip turn. Rip 2 cards out of their hand is pretty strong, but for 5, I opted not to include him, although I think he's an option. Baze, I've been asked about this. I'm very high on the card in general. The issue in this deck is Han has a really hard time maintaining initiative, especially because of his resourcing ability. And I just don't. I play Gamoran Guards because I think it's just a more consistent Sentinel than Baze is. System Patrol Craft is a decent space unit. I think I like the gunships a bit better, but System Patrol Craft does offer a little upside in that it can kind of stall a Fire Spray turn. And then Cunning. Cunning is a serious consideration, especially in conjunction with other discard cards. I think using this in addition to Spark of Rebellion, then maybe if we include Bodhi, I mean, we're like pushing into mono yellow at that point, which is a deck I'm very interested too, like a mono yellow Han with so much discard. But Cunning is strong. I think it could help close out games, something I think this deck might struggle with sometimes because, like we talked about, the units themselves are not aggressively slanted. So having Cunning to be a 4 damage burst can be pretty good. The card is strong. I think it's a serious consideration to get it in there. It's just at that point we're pushing a lot of 6-drops between Obi-Wan and the Vigilance that we have that we might need to trim there. All right. So that's really all I got. It's a deck that I think is quite powerful. I think you could definitely take this to some events and do pretty well with it. I think it's off meta, so sometimes that's a nice boost, especially early on in a game cycle where people won't be really prepared and don't know exactly what it is you're trying to do. We have answers to a lot of things, highlighted by Spark of Rebellion, which is kind of a catch-all. We do a lot of really powerful things, like Han style, right? And none of that is specifically unique to this deck. Like Han can do some really nutty plays sometimes with the double ramp. And I think Luke himself is one of the best things to double ramp into. So we've got that. And yeah, I think there's a lot more you can tweak with this deck. Like I talked about some of the emissions and other considerations, but I'm certain there's other cards that you could play around with. We mentioned like a more heavy aggressive version where we play Jedi lightsaber and probably more forces with me and really try to push that force synergy. Maybe even force throw for 3 could be a consideration, and because then we start bumping up our discard package and start taxing hands even more. So yeah, I think this one's really fun, and I think quite powerful. And yeah, let me know if there's any questions you have, if there's other cards you might be considering. I'd love to hear it. I'd appreciate if you like the video, subscribe to the channel, really keeps it going. And with that, take care.